are you today? Good. Thank you so much for joining us and for being here. I'm going to try to speak into the mic because I saw them mic checking. Is that okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so thank you so much for being here on an oddly beautiful January day, for taking the time to, again, to just be a part of the enrichment of the culture in the city of Stamford and Fairfield County, and just being a part of something like this. It means a lot, taking the time to be here. I want to thank, again, the World Affairs Forum as well as the library, because they do these amazing programs and they bring in wonderful speakers like Victoria. And again, it's the kind of thing that makes me feel really proud to just be a part of the university, especially this campus and in this city where so many positive things are happening, but we don't take work like this for granted. And that type of intellectual work that goes on just by, again, participating and thinking about these things and carrying that dialogue forward is really powerful. So thank you so much. I am thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be able to be a part of working with someone like Victoria even for just a couple of hours. It's really exciting for me. So you heard when you mentioned that I'm a fiction writer. So I say all the time, it's what makes me an effective administrator, because I just make things up. Most of the time it works out. It's okay. I should be careful what I say. One of our students is in the front row and she's taking notes vigorously. So, but no, it's in my world, we do research a certain kind of way. And so my two novels that I've published are set in China. They're historical novels. But I was saying to Victoria before we started that, the type of research that I do is so different, or kind of, it's just unique. It's, in a way, I almost don't consider it research as much as I consider it kind of study or preparation, because I'm trying to do certain things within the fiction. But a researcher's job, and someone who has to understand the totality and how all the dominoes hit each other through the decades, centuries, and so on. Someone like Victoria has such a deeper, wider breadth of knowledge. My research in China, because that's where my books were set, it made me think that, I actually know very little about Hong Kong. And that made me even more excited to be a part of this, because now I get to hear it straight from an expert sitting right next to me. And in all seriousness, it's a very strained and I would say challenging time for that city, from all that I understand, and we'll clearly hear more about that from Victoria, and you all being here for this event with this topic, this subject matter means obviously that you have had some kind of engagement or interaction or connection and understanding with Hong Kong and the region as well. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask Victoria, if you don't mind, if you could maybe just for some of our audience who maybe aren't as up to date on the history of Hong Kong, maybe you can just give us a kind of brief overview how Hong Kong today became what it is.
First of all, can everyone hear me okay? What about now? Is it better? Okay, perfect. Thanks so much for having me here, and thanks so much to the World Affairs Forum for inviting me, because it is very important. Hong Kong is an international city, and it plays a very significant role in American politics. So thank you so much for taking your Sunday afternoon to come to just figure out more about Hong Kong. So when it comes to the first question, Terrence' first question, a brief history of Hong Kong, because the instructions for me is that we want this conversation to last only half an hour, so I will be very brief. Why we talk about so why Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997? Because Hong Kong more or less has three parts. We can think of Hong Kong if you look at the map. At the bottom is the Hong Kong Island. The Hong Kong Island was ceded to the United Kingdom at the end of the First Opium War in 1840-41, and for perpetuity. And then at the end of the Second Opium War, in 1860, then across the harbor, across the Victoria Harbor, the Kowloon Peninsula was also ceded to the United Kingdom, again forever. But then then China, the Qing dynasty and Japan, they fought the war in the late 19th century, and China lost really badly. After that, all the Western powers were like, wow, China is actually much weaker than we thought it was. And then there was this scramble for territory. And so in 1898, the UK also then asked China to just lease a piece of territory north of the Korean Peninsula called the New Territories for 99 years. So because the lease was signed in 1898, so then after 99 years, the lease was coming to due by 1957. This is why there was this whole talk about the Sino-British Joint Declaration and Sino-British negotiations, and then the Hong Kong Basic Law and the one country, two systems model. And so maybe I stop here for now.
Okay, thank you for that. And it got me, as I was kind of preparing for this, and I've never been to Hong Kong. I've read about it a little bit. I'm not very educated in Hong Kong, but I was thinking about it just in preparation for today. It seems to me that Hong Kong is not, and you can correct me, of course, is not a 100% democracy, but it is very democratic and almost, like you said, international, influenced by the West in many ways of its day-to-day life, its cultures. So is that an accurate assessment in terms of just kind of the sensibilities and the philosophies of the people of Hong Kong?
The way that I would characterize Hong Kong's model is it is freedom without democracy. Why freedom? Because under British rule, that essentially the British would always rule many different colonies with a certain degree of rule of law. And also, for my generation, I suppose that we actually grew up in the golden eras of British colonialism because they promoted free education, they promoted very cheap housing, they promoted also very, very cheap medical care. And for my generation, that really was a time when we could do anything we liked. All it took was that we worked hard. We would never have to worry about our future. You could say anything you like, you could call down with whoever, any Chinese leader, or even the Queen. Of course, nobody really had any grudges with the Queen, so nobody would ever do that. But you could really literally criticize any political leaders. You could publish anything. So in that era, it was freedom. It had no democracy, but yet with freedom was because the British governor, although the governor was appointed by London, but the governor ultimately had to be responsible to the UK Parliament. And so there was kind of this democracy from behind that guaranteed all those freedoms. What has then happened after 1997 is that because now the Hong Kong chief executive no longer is answered to another democracy of the sovereign power, but rather the sovereign power behind is itself is a one-party dictatorship. And so without democracy, then a lot of those freedoms that we've enjoyed have been actually taken back one by one. Now I also want to say why there's this perception that Hong Kong is somehow quasi-democratic. It's because that there are actually elections. So on November 24th, maybe it actually made it to all these headline news in the New York Times or CNN or whatever news that you care to pay attention to. The pro-democracy forces won a landslide in this district council elections. But then the district councils actually don't really do much other than taking care of garbage collection, figuring out where to set up bus stops, and a lot of these really local issues. And then when it comes to where matters really important is the Legislative Council. The Legislative Council has 70 seats. Half of them are designated for functional constituencies. And a lot of those constituencies have only corporate votes, and some of them, the numbers is as small as just dozens of them. So they're completely manipulated and controlled by pro-Beijing forces. Half of the seats are returned by geographical elections, except that there's also this proportional representation system, so that again, pro-Beijing forces, they have a lot of money, they have huge mobilization forces. Even so, pro-democracy forces can win quite a bit of those seats, but then they never win all of them, and so they're always in perpetual minority. So this is why that there's kind of quasi-democracy, but it's not quite fully democratic. And it's this system that really cannot, because it's not fully democratic, so then this freedom without democracy model is really not working very well. And also just yesterday, there was this genuine universal election in Taiwan. Hong Kong people all rushed to Taiwan, and they were in tears while The hope is that today's Taiwan will be tomorrow's Hong Kong.
Thank you for clarifying that, because I think, it is very complicated. It's very, without even getting into the which parties are affecting or influencing which seats, and how the voting is controlled to some extent, or again, kind of maneuvered in a particular direction. But I guess what I also take away, just in kind of watching what's happening in Hong Kong with the protests, there is this kind of prevailing sense, this passion for progress, to evolve as a democratic society, and eventually, as you just mentioned, into a formal democratic society. So, is there progress in that particular vein? Do you see mechanisms to actually move Hong Kong to become, like you just said, tomorrow's Taiwan?
Yeah, so essentially things have been actually going in the opposite direction. This is why we are seeing this explosion of protests. The Sino-British Joint Declaration promises Hong Kong one country, two systems. So I mentioned earlier, and one country, two systems. For Beijing at the time, two systems, meaning in their eyes was that, so, China, it has a socialist communist system. Hong Kong has a capitalist system. So in their mind, it was one country, but standing socialist versus capitalist system. But then for Hong Kong people, the Sino-British Joint Declaration also promises that all the freedoms, all the civil and political liberties, the free speech, freedom of expression, all of these freedoms that Hong Kong people cherish a lot should remain in force. And also, Chinese leaders in the 1980s would go around to Western capitals promising that, don't worry, don't even worry about Hong Kong being returned to China. Nothing is going to change other than the change of the flag. Everything is going to stay the same. And for a lot of people in my generation too, when we look at the young people who put on full gear, they confront with the police in a way that we feel very, very guilty almost, because my generation took those promises. Hong Kong people were never consulted. So Beijing and London negotiated over Hong Kong's future without Hong Kong's participation. And people were very, very worried. And then there were bank runs, people were very worried. There were those who would try to leave Hong Kong. And then when the Sino-British Joint Declaration was promulgated in 1984, people kind of sighed of relief. One country, two systems. All those freedoms, all the political and civil liberties will remain enforced. Okay, it's not too bad. And because we were not consulted, we kind of just took the promises seriously. And then we didn't really fight for more. Now, at the same time, the Sino-British Joint Declaration also stipulates that all these promises will be should be enshrined in a Hong Kong Basic Law promulgated by Beijing itself, which came out and also stipulates that the ultimate aim of Hong Kong's government there should be a genuine election of the chief executive and the legislative council. And that all actually people expected all of those to happen by 2007/2008. But then a few years ahead of that, Beijing issued a decision, no, we are not ready, we have to wait. And we have to wait for 10 years. And so in the mid-2010, we heard about the umbrella movements and also the Occupy Central with Peace and Love. So several people, they concluded that if we're going to have genuine universal suffrage by 2017/2018, we have to begin a conversation. And this is why Benny Tai and Cheng Kim-min, who were actually later on sentenced to months in jail, they started to talk about we need the governments to prepare for genuine universal suffrage, or else we are going to occupy Hong Kong's the busiest business district, Central. And then the umbrella movement broke out, and then of course nothing happened. There was never any genuine universal suffrage. And Beijing also issued a decision saying that actually Beijing is going to exercise comprehensive jurisdiction over Hong Kong. And people got very, very upset. The umbrella movements did not get what they wanted. And so then and many people over the years, in the last few years, became very disheartened. People kind of just withdrew, they tried to leave, they tried to get, young people tried to get graduate degrees. And then early on in the last year, in 2019, the government also introduced the extradition bill. For a lot of people, the extradition bill really means the last stand or the last straw in the erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms. Because the bill would have allowed anyone passing through Hong Kong, anyone in Hong Kong, so including you, any one of you here, if you just happen to pass through Hong Kong, and in Beijing, and some Beijing authorities, they said that, well, we actually think that you're liable to a criminal charge, and so we want you to be extradited to China, and then if you happen to have any assets in Hong Kong, that can be frozen. And so many people were very worried. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong was very worried about it. All the international businesses were very worried about it. What is also interesting, why the protests became so big in June was that, so in 2014 during the umbrella movement, a lot of the business leaders were like, okay, Hong Kong has long enjoyed freedoms without democracy all these years. So why do we care about democracy? Why do we, ask for genuine universal suffrage? But the extradition bill is so much more important in the sense that all the business leaders in Hong Kong, they all know that, wow, how can you even make money in Hong Kong without any businesses in China? How can you do any business in China without ever sending any officials gifts? And so anyone feel that, oh my God, I'm going to be in trouble. Another group of people who really stayed behind in 2014, but also came out this time around, are these religious leaders. So a lot of religious leaders in Hong Kong, like religious leaders everywhere else, tend to be conservative. But then, if you're really religious, you also want to promote religion across the border. So a lot of these religious leaders in Hong Kong became very worried. So with these two huge groups of people, then the participation in the anti-extradition protests in June became so big, basically double and triple the previous sizes of protests in Hong Kong.
So I'm looking at my notes and I'm trying to keep up with you as I'm educating and trying to come up with something semi-intelligent. There have been, and I think that's one of the things, if anyone is just starting to kind of have Hong Kong come on the radar, I think it's important to know that this is not the first protest since the handover in 1997. As you mentioned, 2019, obviously, 2014, the umbrella movement, and you talked a little bit about what kind of motivated that movement. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, even previous to 2014, there was at least one, if not two other protests, not of the size and magnitude as of right now. It seems to me that, and referring back to some of the comments you made, to simplify it, it strikes me that the protests are always in response to decisions or the interpretation of decisions that make Beijing the overseer or kind of controller of the things that can and will happen in Hong Kong. It is perceived as a almost systematic stripping away of those freedoms. Even if it wasn't a democracy, there was freedom in the day-to-day life, and every time a decision is made to strip away one or several of those freedoms, then we see this big push. Okay, so here's a question. These protests have become violent in a way that the previous protests had not. Do you have any insight into why things have escalated to, again, a level of violence in particular, because the violence is so graphic and symbolic of what's going on? Any insight into kind of how or why that's happened?
Maybe actually there are two questions there. Let me answer the first one. The first one is that Hong Kong is also called a city of protest, and it is true that protests did not really begin in 2014 with the umbrella movement or 2019 with the anti-extradition protest. So someone of my generation, so I like to say that I was there on the day when Hong Kong's democracy movement was born. So because of this and the British Joint Declaration, because the Joint Declaration promises Hong Kong, we somehow, even though we're not involved in the negotiation, but then it was like, oh, Hong Kong people can actually, it's going to be Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong under a high degree of autonomy. And so the future is to be written by us. So there was this, what I would call kind of Kaohsiung summit. So a lot of the pro-democracy forces in 1986 all called a convention in a place called Kaohsiung. This is why I call it the Kaohsiung summit. And I was a college student, and I attended, and I was all inspired at the time. And then, of course, something happened in a few years later, Tiananmen in 1989. In 1989, the #1 slogan on the street in Hong Kong was, "Today's Tiananmen, tomorrow's Hong Kong." Hong Kong people poured to the streets. They donated money, donated tents, donated all kinds of supplies to support students in China. The idea was that if today's Chinese students can succeed in democratizing China, Hong Kong will have a future. After the crackdown, the slogan, "Today's Tiananmen, tomorrow's Hong Kong," was completely flipped around. If today they could slaughter their own students this way, what would they do to us after 1997? So after that year, in May and June 1989, there were many people pouring out into the street. And afterwards, every year, Hong Kong is really the only place on Chinese territory that would have a candlelight vigil on June 4th every single year. And so I've been going to all those whenever I'm in Hong Kong. And beyond that, and then also January 1st is another kind of like annual exercise that people, again, for whatever good grievances that they complain about, they will also show up to protest. And after 1997, because the handover is on July 1st, 1997, so every July 1st, people will also pour out in the streets to protest. So these are kind of the key days every year. And then what happened also in 2003 was that Beijing, and then I think you're quite right, Hong Kong people, if they can continue to live the way that they like it, if they are left alone, they get really too busy taking care of other things. So I remember when I was still living in Hong Kong, my family was still taking care of a kid, and you know how middle class kids, you take them to piano lessons and ballet lessons and whatever lessons and all of those things. You don't have time to go protest, right? So when people are left alone, they really don't want to waste time going out. But when they feel that their freedoms are really encroached on, then they would reschedule everything to go protest. And in Hong Kong, because the humidity and the heat is so bad, you go out, you sweat like hell. It's really miserable to go protest in the summer in Hong Kong. But people do that because, this is something is much more important than your personal comfort. And so every year that happens. And then in 2003, Beijing wanted Hong Kong to impose a national security bill, and essentially introducing China's kind of national security in Hong Kong. Now this is actually stipulated in the basic law for Hong Kong, except that the way it was introduced did not really guarantee that the bill would also be consistent with the international civil and political rights. And Hong Kong's basic law also stipulates that there should be a human rights law, and then everything else should be, all the Hong Kong laws should be consistent with the international civil and political rights. And so these are all the problems. And so I think you're quite right. Beijing likes to say that, whether we look at Taiwan, whether we look at Hong Kong, these people protest because the Americans are the black hands. Americans are, training people, paying people to go protest. How much money can you pay these young people to risk their lives? And these days when the police, will show up, they beat you up, they fire tear gas you, they beat you up, they put their boots on your head, they break your bones. When you're in detention center, they torture you even more. And then you are subject to, and then when they charge you for rioting, and if you are convicted, you are liable to 10 years in jail. How much money can I pay anyone to, risk your life, your career like this? So this is all nonsense. It's really all about what Beijing has been doing that actually has motivated people to go to pour out in the street and vote for Cheng in Taiwan, or really try to defend the freedoms that they've grown up with. Now then, why the second question? Why the protests have become violent? So I think during the umbrella movement in 2014, there were all these international news headlines. Hong Kong protesters are so organized. You have these young people, they show up at protest sites in their uniform, they organize, because a lot of students, they're younger students, they're university students would then organize these actually tutorial sessions for secondary school students. And these kids in uniform would try to sort the garbage and recycle them. They clean up the streets, they clean up even public toilets, because they were all sharing the same bathroom, public restrooms in occupied sites. So why all these very organized, people who wants to be very organized, very non-violent, was turned violent this time? I think that this is all encapsulated in one slogan. On July 1st last year, that some young people, they stormed into the Legislative Council building and they graffiti for the first time on the wall. It's you, the Hong Kong government, who has taught us that peaceful protests, peaceful demonstrations have no effect. You think about it. So after all of these years of protesting, also a lot of Hong Kong people, they take the lesson from the failure of the umbrella movement. We asked for genuine universal suffrage in 2014. We were very nonviolent, we were very organized, and nothing happened. It failed. And then last year, on June 9th, and there were about 1 million people who protested against the extradition bill. And then the same evening, the chief executive said, well, the bill is going to go ahead. And then on Wednesday, June 12th, the bill was supposed to be debated at the Legislative Council building. Tens of thousands of people surrounded the Legislative Council building so that the electrical could not be in session. And then there were confrontations with the police. And then by the end of the day, the government said that, well, there was a riot today and we arrested all these rioters, and so we're going to continue with the bill. And then somehow on Saturday, the government said, we're going to suspend the bill. But the government refused to still formally withdraw the bill. The difference is that if it is on the table, as I said before, the Legislative Council is designed in a way that the government can push through any bill, because the pro-democracy forces are always in minority. The government always can count on all the pro-Beijing legislators to push through any bill that the government wants to get passed. And so people are very worried that if the bill is not withdrawn, then it could just be passed anytime. And so even after, so then when the government announced they were going to suspend the bill on Saturday, people did not really take it. On Sunday, June 16th, 2 million people show up. Now they still continue to ask for the formal withdrawal of the bill. They also said because the police already used excessive force on Wednesday against the protesters, and so that should be investigated into, and also that the characterization of riots should be withdrawn. And those people arrested for rioting should also basically be given amnesty. So this is why now you hear people talk about the 5 demands, so all related to actually what happened on June 12th. So some people also say that, well, the organizers exaggerated the number of people. Maybe not exactly 1 million on June 9th, maybe not exactly 2 million on June 16th. But if you see those pictures, Hong Kong's business streets were completely filled with people. Seas of blacks. People, essentially, you cannot really see, you look at these drone images. It's not possible that you could have in this many people and still say that, the entire society is not really all up in arms. And so with all of this, essentially, people power, it hasn't really convinced the governments to change. This is why by July 1st, so young people said, it's you who has taught us that non-violence and peaceful protests don't work. I would also say that, so I happen to teach courses on violence and non-violence resistance movements. Very often that when you see in many different cases that we have actual academic studies showing that in almost all the other movements, if you can reach the threshold of 3.5% of public participation in any movement, throughout history, those movements would always succeed. Hong Kong's population is 7.4 million. So even if 1 million, 2 million size is significantly exaggerated, we are still talking about, at least 1 out of 7 of Hong Kong people participated. Why fail? Because we're dealing with a sovereign power in Beijing that does not really listen to the voices of Hong Kong people. And at the same time, there are many actually different forms of nonviolent peaceful protest, except a lot of those have been rendered ineffective as well. So Beijing, one thing Beijing is very worried about is color revolutions. So those color revolutions, what is really the hallmark of them is that they are nonviolent. And then, so Beijing's line is that students, you guys want to organize class boycott, workers, you want to organize strikes, that's really not allowed. One very notable example is on August 5th, about 300,000 people actually participated in the general strike. And some of hundreds of those work for Cathay Pacific, Hong Kong's flagship airlines. A week later, Beijing's air control authorities told Cathay Pacific, you have to hand over the list of those the employees who participated in the general strike, or you're not going to be able to fly over China's airspace. The CEO just put down his own name and then resigned. That was not sufficient. So very soon there's been almost essentially, also because mainland companies own 30% of Cathay Pacific shares. So essentially they fired these people and then they took over it, and then in the aftermath, so all of those people who, the only thing they had to do to get into trouble is that on their own Facebook say, go Hong Kong. And then also, and then they get fired. They will be invited to the manager's office, is this your Facebook account? Yes, you're fired. And then also, not just that, because sometimes it's difficult to know who posts anything on Facebook. So they use your friends. They encourage co-workers to report to one another. So when even non-violent means of protest, so strikes and boycotts, these have proven to be very effective even against the apartheid regime of South Africa, rendered ineffective in the Hong Kong situation. What else is left? Another thing is that Hong Kong is also famous for the London Wall, those posing. So people would like in tunnels and different places and staircases, they would have artworks and posters and to promote the messages that calls for democracy. What has happened to those London walls? So the authorities were saying buses loads of people to take those things down, take all the displays down, so you can put them up, but then the next day they'll be taken down. And also these days that there are police officers just basically patrolling these very obvious London Wall sites so that people cannot put things up anymore. So these very peaceful means of protest are really rendered ineffective or rendered impossible. This is why these young people feel that. I don't agree with them because I think that if non-violence is not effective, it doesn't mean that violence is effective either. But this is the kind of the message that young people have, the lesson that they have drawn. And I would also like to say that why the majority of Hong Kong people are still behind the protest despite the turn to violence is because people in my generation feel very guilty. Why we took the words of why we took the promises then, why we didn't fight for more, why we didn't fight for Hong Kong's participation, why we didn't push for a general universal suffrage before 1997. So we didn't do all those things, and today's young people are taking on all these heavy burdens.
And I want to pick up there because it's a very sobering analysis or assessment of the situation, and whether it's personally or professionally, I feel like I'm sure many of us have felt that way. You've been out there, you've stood up for a cause, and you've been with 50 or 100,000, 500,000 people. I mean, we've had a very turbulent few years with this U.S. administration, and you can see that the level of activity, not to say that that's unique in United States history, but for our time, there's a lot going on. So it's really kind of, again, sobering to hear you say that these students, this younger generation that is out there protesting right now, almost, it seems to me at least, that it almost feels like they don't think they have a choice, that this is the only way to make inroads, to potentially find that path for progress, because they have tried peaceful, nonviolent methods, and almost like a sense of desperation has come over them, that they feel like, well, these are the only tools that we have left, you know, it does remind me a little bit, and I'd like to get your feedback on that. I was in London last April, and there were protests across the city about climate change. And they were shutting down the tube, and they had shut down bridges, and they had shut down Trafalgar Square. And I mean, you know, again, here's me and my goofy family, and we're walking around looking for the Winston Churchill statue, and you walk dead center into a square filled with people. And again, it was very organized, but one thing that I took away was their intent was not just to protest and to be seen, it was to disrupt. It was to disrupt the everyday and to make someone feel something, whether that was discomfort or even a level of kind of pain. They needed to try to make you feel something. So I'd like your feedback.
You're quite right that even the umbrella movements, because they often try to occupy the very busy highways and business districts, it was a way to essentially, because when people can continue to go to work and continue to, you know, take your kids to ballet lessons, you don't think about what exactly is wrong with the society. It's when things kind of like get disrupted. Oh, why are these people doing all these things? You know, what do they want? Why? And so then you pause and think. So that's the whole rationale for disruptive tactics. And this is quite right. But then at the same time though, so also what the government has done is that, okay, you guys want to, you know, block traffic in different places, then we're also going to make it impossible for you to travel around to do all that. This is also why the government has actually taken over the Hong Kong's metro system. So anytime there's a protest, they shut down the metro station in those surrounding areas. And so to make it impossible for people to move around, and then they would just mass in police officers to encircle people. And so then you get actually many people arrested as well. But another thing I also want to highlight, people really feel a strong sense of desperation. So this is why they call this the last stand. But at the same time, they have also learned a lesson that, well, maybe economic boycotts and strikes can still be effective if we can get enough people, if we can get more than 300,000 people. And if people are unionized, you know. So then in the latest protest, people forming the unions, organizations, people trying to actually get together. They're also talking about forming this yellow economic circle. Yellow refers to the pro-democracy forces. Blue refers to pro-Beijing forces. So then you boycott the blue businesses and try to, and those pro-democracy forces should only go to yellow businesses. Hopefully, because ultimately, over 7,000 people have been arrested. And the attrition is really, really high, and many of these young people come out with severe injuries. So how to keep this struggle sustainable? So we have to do this is why I have to really go back to nonviolence means.
So I'm getting the cue that we're running a little short on time. We do want to get to Q&A with the audience. Let me ask you one final question, which is pretty straightforward. Do you think a military crackdown like Tiananmen Square is possible? And in that same vein, what do you think we are going to see with this particular movement in the next, few months to a year, and can we see some type of conclusion?
Yes, Beijing has threatened to use the PLA. So in the end of July last year, they released these videos saying that it's basically showing that the People's Liberation Army were already doing rights training. Except that because Beijing really needs Hong Kong to preserve its special economic status. So this is really the one trump card Hong Kong has, is its special economic status. This is also where the US policy is so important. I'm one of those who actually helped to push through the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which would require that the State Department every year files a report showing the state of Hong Kong's autonomy, and also that certain officials who violate Hong Kong's human rights can be subject to sanctions. This is very important. Now, Beijing really understands the utility of Hong Kong's economic status. They don't want Hong Kong to lose its economic status. Now, one of the things about in the act is that Beijing has, all these high-tech dual-use technologies are banned for exports to China. But Hong Kong is exempted from this. So a lot of these Beijing companies, they set up their shops in Hong Kong, they import these technologies and turn around and then ship them over to China. This is one of the things. And then also, Beijing has used Hong Kong to raise trillions of dollars over the years. And so Beijing needs Hong Kong, Beijing needs the US to maintain Hong Kong's special economic status. For this reason alone, it's unlikely that they will actually send on the PRA. But this is not to say that there has not been a very bloody crackdown. We have been seeing very bloody crackdowns. As you know, a lot of these people, protesters, they are beaten up, they are tortured. And so what Beijing has done is to turn Hong Kong's police forces into just basically mainland forces. Hong Kong's police used to be Asia's finest, but in a few months' time, just because they no longer, actually they listen to Beijing's orders rather than to Hong Kong, rather than answer to Hong Kong people. So they basically have no hesitance in just beating up people. And then at the same time, there's another part is this what I would call whole society repression, or what Hong Kong people call white terror. So the example of the Cathay Pacific, so essentially trying to tell people that you want to protest, you support the protesters, you lose your job, you lose your career, so you think twice. So this is going on with different sectors, not just airlines, but also all civil servants, teachers. Some teachers were arrested, even though they have not been charged, already fired. So and then medical workers, firefighters who've been really on the side of protesters against the police. And so a lot of these things are going on. How are we going to see the end game? I don't think this is going to come to an end. Beijing just replaced the liaison officer in Hong Kong, and this guy is very, very senior. And so essentially Beijing is really still wants to impose comprehensive jurisdiction over Hong Kong, which means total violation of the one country, two systems model. Then Hong Kong people are going to continue to resist. So then at the same time, how do you, with all the attrition, how to keep the struggle sustainable? So people are getting unionized, and then we're also trying to the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, people are putting a lot of hope on that.
This is, you being a native of Hong Kong, obviously this is something that not only are you a scholar, but you're also a native, and clearly something you're very passionate about, but must also be challenging for you at times. So thank you for sharing your insights and your time with us. We're going to take some questions from the audience.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Hi. You mentioned that the government could reach people who participate in any protest with what's going on. Do you think they could reach anyone who boycott or don't buy any technology or anything? In a sense, if everybody was to participate in a boycott where they don't do anything, would that be effective with, so to speak, so it don't be like violent or any type of, nobody could identify them? I mean, I would think that would work much better. Do you agree, or do you think it won't work, or have they tried it?
This is a good question. Already, some of the yellow-coated businesses have been vandalized. Now, at the same time, we also can say that some protesters have also vandalized blue-coated businesses, and so this has been going on. But if I go walk into a yellow shop instead of a blue shop, this is something I don't think that the authorities can know. But then there are things that they can target the business themselves because they're listed.
What can we do? There's such anguish watching 7.5 million free Hong Kong citizens in this struggle. Our government has its voice. What can we as citizens do to make sure you're feeling less lonely and actually apply some leverage?
Well, thank you so much. I would say that, talk to your congressman. So the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act was passed by first the House and then the Senate. And then when it went to, it basically when it was veto-proof when it went to the president's desk. The president was like, I stand with freedom, but I also stand with presidency. So I would say that, I really like, fellow American citizens to put pressure on your senators, on your House of Representatives, and on the US President, whoever is going to get re-elected. I'm also a little worried about the trade war because I think that President Trump is using Hong Kong as really a bargaining chip in the trade war with China. And some Hong Kong people, they wave the flag and they praise President Trump. I get a little nervous about that because if Hong Kong is only a bargaining chip, which means that, Hong Kong can get support, but Hong Kong can also be dumb if somehow that, Trump can reach a deal with Beijing. So I get very nervous about it. But, write to your representative, write to the White House, you say, I'm a resident of whichever state, and it happens to be one of the swing states, that's even more important.
Hi, you mentioned that you believe that the protests should move away from violent action and move more towards nonviolent negotiation. And because the nonviolent protests have gone on for so long and they haven't really had much of an effect, how do you think that would bring about any change? What kind of negotiations, and do you think Beijing would be really willing to come to the table and make any concessions? Because it seems like they're pretty, not willing to concede anything.
Great. So what I meant is about nonviolence is not just about the negotiations. A lot of people also say that because this is more or less a leaderless movement, so then people would say, well, if this is a leaderless movement, you don't have any leaders that the governments can negotiate with. So I don't really mean negotiation. I mean that because violence, one, it makes it so much harder. So another thing that the Hong Kong issue has had quite a bit of difficulty getting support from the American left, partly because it has turned violent. And then at the same time, that even with the umbrella movement, when it was strictly nonviolent, already it's because I suppose there's I vote Democrat, but then I can also see that whenever I try to promote the Hong Kong cause to the American left, they see China as a socialist party, and then there's a lot of talk that Beijing has lifted millions out of poverty. So there's a lot of sympathy for Beijing. But I would say that Beijing really is not a socialist system. It practices the most brutal form of capitalism and exploiting a lot of those workers and peasants. So we have to understand that. And at the same time, what I really mean is that nonviolence is important, not to have negotiations. If the 5 demands that there should be formal withdrawal of the extradition bill, that's done. But then the dropping the characterization of the protests as riots, dropping the charges of rioting, holding an independent investigation into police abuses, and opening discussion over general universal suffrage. These things the government can do without negotiating with any members of the opposition. What I mean is that the movement itself has to be sustainable. The movement itself has to continue to broaden its support from among Hong Kong people. And it also needs to recruit as much support as possible from the international community. So far, we've had difficulty reaching out to the American left, and partly the reason is because it's kind of like they side with socialism, but also because of the trend to violence. A lot of these things are not, so violence is not conducive to the goal of sustaining the movement. So this is what I mean.
A Hong Kong friend wrote to me just a day or two ago that she thought that Carrie Lam had introduced the extradition bill, which seemed to me unbelievable. I assumed it was done on orders from Hong Kong. What's your thought of that, and who selected Carrie Lam as the chief executive?
Oh, this is a very great question. This is precisely what we were talking about earlier, why Hong Kong people asked for genuine universal suffrage. It's because Hong Kong people actually expected to have the elections of the chief executive after 2007/2008. Because the basic law says that the ultimate aim is universal suffrage, except that the chief executive is really selected by a narrow group, 1,200, as called election committee, and most of those members, they come from the same kind of functional constituencies, so most of them are very pro-Beijing. Now, elected district councillors, elected legislators also become members of this 1,200 member committee. And so the chief executive would never get all the votes. but we get enough votes. And then who would get those votes is whoever Beijing was. So Carrie Lam, the current chief executive, she was chosen because once Beijing anointed her, everyone had to step away. And so this is why when you have this person who is supposed to, serve Hong Kong, but ultimately really answers to Beijing, this is why one country, two systems is not working at all. It's really just Beijing exercising direct rule with the facade of, having a figurehead in Hong Kong. And then the extradition bill early on, Carrie Lam took all the blame. I did it, I introduced it. But obviously, why would someone really without any authority would do anything unless she was under the order of Beijing? And so we've actually more stories coming out showing that actually that was in fact the case. Beijing wanted to do this. Why they wanted to have the extradition bill? Because in several cases of very famous kidnappings. One case of booksellers kidnapped from Hong Kong, and then also a very rich Chinese business guy was kidnapped from the Four Seasons Hotel in Hong Kong. These cases, again, they blatantly violate one country, two systems, that mainland forces are not supposed to enforce the law in Hong Kong. And so Beijing wanted to legalize kidnappings.
It would also kill Hong Kong as the main business channel into China. Some of the things you described earlier would kill just businesses in the world offshore.
Exactly. And so people all the business community, the entire business communities, international communities were against it. And only so why they wanted to do that? Why Carrie Lam, who, she is not exactly stupid, but why she would do that if not under the order of Beijing? So you're quite right.
I'd like your perspective a little bit on the sort of the economic background. If you go back to 1997 and a few years that follow that, Hong Kong was an important economic engine in the world. China was a very poor country, and so there was a terrific imbalance there. In recent years, China has changed considerably. It's much more prosperous. The people in China have perhaps less freedoms in a political sense, but in a day-to-day sense, they seem to have much more in terms of their day-to-day livelihood. So there's been a balance shift there, and therefore Hong Kong seems to be perhaps a little bit less important as that channel and economic engine that was such an important plum for China back in the late 1990s. So I see that balance as changing, and therefore the 3.5% tipping point, doesn't it need to really include all of China? Because the fear in Beijing is probably that the protests and the discontent that you're feeling in Hong Kong, because they had something that was given, that they had, that was taken away, whereas the people in China had something new that they didn't have before. So there's that big change. Wouldn't China be terribly frightened that there would be an overflow of these protests coming into all of China?
Great, thank you so much. I am glad that you brought this up. Essentially, the China's economic power and Hong Kong's economic importance is essentially once China has become a big economic powerhouse in the world, especially after 2008, after the global financial crisis, and then China became the world's second largest economy. And China's economic clout has grown so much that Hong Kong basically has really lost its soul. And we can see that, so even international multinationals, when they have all exercised self-censorship, they don't really criticize China, they dare not say anything harsh about Beijing's policy toward Tibetans or Uyghurs, and now Hong Kong, so they also there's this saying that there are 3 T's that you don't talk about, Tibet, Taiwan, and Tiananmen. So if Beijing can even coerce all those international Western democracies and international businesses to silence themselves. Obviously, Hong Kong really has very little role to play. But yet, at the same time, I also want to emphasize that while Hong Kong's relative percentage as part of China's overall GNP has really come down a lot to only 3%, Hong Kong's special status is still very, very significant. It's very significant so that Beijing is very careful. And I think that a colleague from UCSD said that just over the last 4 years, Beijing raised $4 trillion from Hong Kong. And also that because the renminbi, the yuan, is not floatable, and it is floatable on the international market through the Hong Kong dollar. So Hong Kong's economic significance is still very important, and they will still really need, for example, using Hong Kong to import dual-use technologies. And then when it comes to your second question about, sorry, the last part of your question was?
So just the overflow of the protests.
Yeah, so at this, you're quite right. Beijing is really trying to make Hong Kong safe for China. And then at the same time, Beijing has done such a really good job at re-educating the post-Tiananmen generation. So today's young Chinese don't know about Tiananmen, or they know about it, they don't care. And just also that I have a lot of colleagues from mainland China, and they don't understand Hong Kong's situation, they don't understand the Taiwan elections. They see that, if you have prosperity, stability, that's great. Why would you care about, antagonizing Beijing? And so, faced with this, I like to say that, well, if the majority of mainland Chinese don't care about democracy, then why is Xi Jinping so worried about making Hong Kong safe for mainland China? Just let Hong Kong be Hong Kong.
Thank you. It seems to me that Hong Kong is lacking a strategy. I mean, you could have yellow umbrellas and stuff like that, but where are you going to go from there? It seems that they ought to be thinking about something like the Switzerland model, kind of more of a neutral power in a broader economy of Europe, where Hong Kong says we are an economic power, we have facilities, we have technology, we have capability. Yes, we're affiliated with China, but yet we are independent and we can service all of Asia, we can service all of the world to become more like a New York. New York is a financial center. It stands on its own. London, who knows what will happen with Brexit, but it stands on its own feet as an international financial center. So it seems that, if they need much more of a longer term vision of where do they fit into the world, not just as a domino of China.
That's great. I think that Hong Kong people do have a strategy in the sense of just really making Beijing honor the one country, two systems model, honoring the promises of high degree of autonomy, with Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong rather than Hong Kong puppets ruling Hong Kong. And at the same time, I would say that Taiwan would be better, more suitable to follow the Switzerland model. Hong Kong really cannot ask for independence. Now, the latest poll shows that about 17% of Hong Kong people support independence. And then at different rallies, you also see people waving the flag for independence. And this actually also gets Beijing very, very worried, because after July 1st last year already, instead of saying that Hong Kong people want genuine universal suffrage, that this is really all about, we don't really like the extradition bill or Beijing's erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms, Beijing's line, and a lot of mainland Chinese have bought it, is that this is all about independence. But when, in fact, kind of what Terrence was saying earlier, that Hong Kong people would be content if they're just being left alone. But it's the encroachment of freedoms that actually got people to say, well, one country, two systems is not working. And Taiwanese concluded that the Hong Kong model is not going to work. And the one country, two systems model was originally designed for Taiwan, and they implemented it in Hong Kong first to serve as a model for Taiwan. So we kind of collectively understand this is not working. But at the same time, we also understand that, the US is not going to support Hong Kong independence, right? And so we want to be realistic. We want to emphasize one country, two systems, autonomy. And so Hong Kong can then, with that, then Hong Kong can preserve its role as still the international city, the international financial city of Asia. But otherwise, yeah, it's tricky.
It is. Well, that's why I use the word neutrality as opposed to independence.
Yeah, I want to ask, in terms of maintaining the momentum of the resistance movement, and especially keeping it nonviolent, it seems to me that that would be extremely difficult without a charismatic leadership or leader. So what I'm asking is, do you see, or can you identify anyone in Hong Kong who might be able to fill such a role?
Yes, so I think the rationale for behind this question is, well, in the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, we think of Martin Luther King. In India, we think of Gandhi. In South Africa, we think of Mandela, right? Well, but then in almost all of these movements, there are actually many, many different layers of leaders. And so one thing that people like to say when it comes to Tibet, for example, maybe the biggest drawback is having a very revered leader. Everyone listens to what the Dalai Lama says. And then people actually don't want to challenge him, and then they also don't take their own initiatives. So the literature on nonviolence actually say that it's cool to have a charismatic leader who says something that everyone follows. But at the same time, that also puts you at ease. So the umbrella movement had this kind of, I would say, multi-generational leadership. So the three people, the Occupy trio who called for the Occupy movement, they were all sentenced, all convicted. And then there was also this federation of college students. The leaders, again, were all convicted. And then another layer was, at the time, secondary students who have now become adults. So Joshua Wong, very famous Hong Kong person, I would say that Joshua Wong has done more than anyone else in talking to Rubio and Rubio pushing through the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. So this multi-generation of elders and also the pro-democracy legislators, and then also the college students and secondary students, form a really tight leadership, except that everyone who was in any leadership position in 2014, everyone was arrested and convicted. And this is why this time around they said that we want to be water, we want to be leaderless. Is it a drawback? It is, in the sense that very often that, there were many cases that people did doing very stupid things. For example, one of the famous incidents was that on August 13th, that in the Hong Kong airports, they shut down the Hong Kong airports, they beat up 2 mainlanders, and then there were actually pro-democracy legislators going there, don't do that, this is stupid, you can't do this is going to get you 10 years in jail, it's just really stupid, and all the international cameras were all there. So this is a major drawback, that it's also why that, there seems to be kind of a lack of a coherent strategy. But then we have to balance the pros and cons, the costs and benefits, knowing that anyone who is a leader is certain to be arrested.
Well, you said they've been convicted. Are they all in jail now?
Some of them are out, and some of them are still in jail. For example, Benny Tai got bail out, but then Cheng is still in jail.
But I mean, so I guess can't outside pressure be exerted to try to?
Yes, definitely. So I think this is where the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act comes in. When these well-known people are arrested and tortured, then there should be sanctions. Except that today, these police officers, they mask themselves. They do not show their IDs. So we don't really know who these police officers are doing the beatings. And then another thing is that, in a way that there's actually, so what we need is not just about having one charismatic leader. What we need is actually having a more decentralized leadership, but yet they are coordinated. They are actually these people. So for example, why I'm working, doing what I do now, other than my core research, historical research, is when I graduated, my second job was to work for Martin Lee. Martin Lee is considered the father of the grandfather of Hong Kong's democracy movement. Pelosi called him now the grandfather, not the godfather of Hong Kong's democracy movement anymore. So we have actually a whole generation of people who came of age from the 1980s. Martin Lee and the pro-democracy legislators, and also all those district councillors. These people actually, because they're elected, they actually have the mandate. So it would be actually a nice thing that they work together. and then to kind of come up with decisions together to have better coordination. It's, at the same time, this is also getting a little difficult because I would say Hong Kong is not unique in that. Throughout the world, people in the opposition almost hate each other as much as they hate the regime. So I think this is a problem that we see that, a lot of Democrats like today, they don't really like each other either. And so this is a problem. And it is difficult to really resolve that, but I see that now, what is really striking, that the pan-Democrats, they used to denounce any kind of violence. But now somehow that why the violence has been going on is because even the traditional Democrats who used to really were allergic to violence, including people like me, kind of feel guilty. And so don't really want to come out to denounce the young people's turn to violence. And so this unity actually has still been sustaining itself. And so with this unity, and then hopefully that I'm trying to actually champion that all these elected councillors can work together. They have the mandate to speak for Hong Kong people.
I'm going to give you 2 more questions, so if you could ask your questions one at a time and then she'll answer them together. So these are the last 2.
I read that there at least was one constituency in Hong Kong that did rise up and protest along with the students, and that were a bunch of lawyers. Is that correct? Now, if the lawyers can do that and not get thrown in jail, couldn't other constituencies of, mature, older, middle-class people with a certain amount of economic and other power, couldn't they do what the lawyers would do? Is it possible that some movement of older people could take hold?
And the last question.
Just to follow up on all the points that have been made, part of the problem for those of us who have spent many years in that part of Asia and have talked with Hong Kong citizens about how would you describe your system, the first word, we're a capitalist system. We would probably say we're a democracy, and then we've spent years trying to define it. So isn't that still part of the issue, that defining who they are other than a capitalist system is part of the issue? How do they define themselves? How do they want to define themselves for the future?
I think this is an interesting question. I don't think I ever gave that answer. The Hong Kong system is capitalist. I think a lot of Hong Kong people today would say that, it's autonomy. It's about autonomy, it's about our freedoms. Yeah.
But they've grown up within the concept of being a capitalist system.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's just like, as I said before, the people in my generation, for a lot of people, they didn't really support the Occupy movement because, we've lived all those decades without democracy, so it's okay that we can preserve our freedoms. But I think with the extradition bill, even the business leaders understood that, well, actually, no. This is not going to be sustainable, this is not going to be viable, because whenever Beijing wants to do something, they want to legalize kidnappings, they can do it. And that would jeopardize even our own business interests. And then the other question, exactly, this is why earlier I mentioned that Beijing, even though Beijing is unlikely to send us the PRA, but they have subverted Hong Kong's police forces, they also using non-physical forms of repression, whole of society repression. Because this entire movement has widespread societal support. So not just lawyers, you have firefighters, you have medics, you have teachers, you have even so accountants and finance sectors, they've all organized their separate groups to support the protest. And Beijing does not like this. This is why they are basically using all the economic power to get people fired, to get people dismissed. With the civil service, already people are being dismissed, and firefighters. Very often, when there are problems, then people, especially for example, there's this big case when thugs were attacking people in Yunnan Station. The police looked the other way, and then firefighters say, "Call us, we'll come within 5 minutes." And the police hate firefighters, and firefighters actually do get arrested. And then medical workers. So a UK representative, a man, he actually visited Hong Kong during the invasion of the Polytechnic University, and he was horrified that even medical workers and doctors and nurses and volunteers, they got arrested and their hands tied in the back. They were all forced to face the wall and all of that. It was that kind of humiliation. So this whole society support is very important. This is going to help keep the movement sustainable. At the same time, we need to do something to guard against Beijing's whole of society repression as well. And this is why people understand that they're organizing, creating new units as never happened before.
Thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about going forward.